Daughter is seriously ill, but millionaire husband cares for the mistress. Black wife decides to take revenge on him. Hi, my amazing story family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. I want to share something with you all. Lately, I've been feeling a bit upset and disturbed because I'm not sure if my stories are connecting with you the way I hope they are. I noticed there were no comments on my last video, and it made me question if I'm doing enough to satisfy you, my beloved audience. I put so much time and effort into creating these stories, and your feedback means the world to me. It's what keeps me motivated and inspired. If you enjoy my stories and want me to continue, please let me know by writing yes in the comment box. If there's anything you'd like me to improve or change, I'd truly appreciate your suggestions. Thank you for being part of Mr. Peter Stories. Your support keeps this journey alive, and I'm so grateful to have you here. Let's begin. The Manhattan skyline glittered like scattered diamonds against the velvet night sky as Christabel Morgan adjusted her emerald silk gown in the back of her town car. Her heart raced with the familiar pre-speech jitters, though she'd done this countless times before. Tonight's Equal Education Foundation Gala wasn't just another charity event. It was her chance to secure funding for inner-city schools that desperately needed support. "We're here, Ms. Morgan," her driver announced, pulling up to the Metropolitan Museum of Art's illuminated facade. Christabel took one final glance in her compact mirror. Her dark skin glowed with a carefully applied highlight, and her naturally coiled hair was styled in an elegant updo that had taken her stylist Marcus nearly 2 hours to perfect. At 32, she had already made a name for herself as one of New York's most formidable civil rights attorneys. But in this world of old money and older prejudices, appearance was, unfortunately, just as important as accomplishment. The cool October air kissed her shoulders as she emerged from the car, cameras flashing immediately. She had learned to wear their attention like armor, each flash a reminder of how far she'd come from the housing projects of Detroit where she'd grown up. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to put her through school, and now here she was, ascending the Met steps like a modern-day Cinderella, except she wasn't here to meet a prince. She was here to change lives. The Great Hall was transformed into a glittering wonderland of crystal and candlelight. Champagne flowed freely as New York's elite moved through the space like exotic fish in an aquarium of wealth. Christabel recognized most of them from previous events or courtroom battles. Old money clutching their pearls, new money flashing their tech wealth, and the social climbers desperate to distinguish themselves from either group. "Christabel, darling," Maxine Powell, the foundation's chairwoman, air-kissed her cheeks. "You look absolutely stunning. Are you ready for your speech?" "Born ready," Christabel replied with a confident smile. Though the index cards in her clutch felt heavy with responsibility, she had spent weeks crafting this speech, ensuring every word would resonate with these potential donors. As she made her way through the crowd, she felt it, that peculiar sensation of being watched. Not the usual curious glances she'd grown accustomed to as often being the only black woman in these spaces, but something more intense. She turned, scanning the room, and that's when she saw him. He stood apart from the typical clusters of socializing guests, leaning against a marble column with an air of casual ownership of the space. Tall, with broad shoulders, emphasized by an impeccably tailored black tuxedo, he had the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. Strong jawline, aristocratic nose, and steel-grey eyes that were fixed directly on her. His dark hair was styled in that perfectly imperfect way that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and for a moment, the bustling noise of the gala seemed to fade away. He didn't smile or nod or make any of the usual acknowledgements. He simply held her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. Christabel forced herself to look away first. She hadn't come here to get lost in some stranger's eyes, no matter how magnetic they might be. She had a mission, And years of experience had taught her that men who looked like that, who carried themselves with that level of entitled confidence, were usually more trouble than they were worth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maxine's voice rang out through the hall, "please take your seats. Our keynote speaker this evening is someone very special." Christabel made her way to the podium, her heels clicking confidently against the marble floor. As she took her position, she saw him again, now seated at one of the front tables. Those grey eyes hadn't left her. She began her speech, her voice clear and passionate as she painted a picture of educational inequality in America. She spoke of brilliant minds dimmed by lack of resources, of children with dreams bigger than their circumstances, of a future that could be brighter if only those with means would invest in it. She shared statistics, but more importantly, she shared stories, real accounts of students she'd met through her work, their potential waiting to be unleashed. "Education isn't just about books and tests," she concluded, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. "It's about hope. It's about opportunity. It's about breaking cycles of poverty that have persisted for generations. Tonight you have the power to change lives. The question is, will you?" The applause was thunderous. Christabel could see checkbooks emerging from designer clutches and interior jacket pockets. She had done her job. Now it was time to work the room, to seal these commitments personally. She was speaking with a hedge fund manager about his potential donation when she felt a presence behind her. The hair on the back of her neck stood up before she even turned around. "Impressive speech," a deep voice said. "Though I noticed you didn't mention the role of private enterprise in education reform." She turned to find the grey-eyed stranger standing there, somehow even more imposing up close. He held 2 champagne flutes, offering one to her. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the glass but not drinking from it. "And you are?" "Colton Sebastian," he said, as if the name should mean something to her. From the slight shift in his expression she could tell it usually did. "Of Sebastian Enterprises," he added when she didn't show any recognition. "We have some interests in the education sector." Ah, now she placed him. Sebastian Enterprises was a corporate giant known for aggressive acquisitions and somewhat controversial business practices. They'd recently started buying up private schools and educational technology companies. "By interests, do you mean profitable ones?" she challenged, raising an eyebrow. Instead of being offended, he smiled, a slow, appreciative curve of his lips that transformed his entire face. "Profit and social good aren't mutually exclusive, Ms. Morgan. In fact, I'd argue that sustainable change requires both. And I'd argue that treating education as a commodity is part of the problem," she countered. "Then we should definitely continue this discussion over dinner," he said smoothly. "Tomorrow night?" Christabel almost laughed at his presumption. "Mr. Sebastian, I don't make dinner plans with strangers," he finished. "Neither do I, usually. But I have a proposal that might interest both you and the Foundation." He pulled out a business card, thick, cream-colored stock with embossed lettering. 7 o'clock, Le Bernardin. Unless you're afraid your convictions won't hold up under closer scrutiny." It was a challenge, carefully wrapped in silk. Christabel knew she was being played, but she was also intrigued. If Sebastian Enterprises was seriously interested in educational initiatives, it could mean real funding for her causes, and if this was just some elaborate ploy to get a dinner date, well, she'd dealt with worse. "I don't scare easily, Mr. Sebastian," she said, finally taking a sip of the champagne he'd brought her. "But I should warn you, I don't compromise my principles for any price." "I wouldn't expect you to," he replied, and something in his tone made her look at him sharply. There was admiration there, yes, but something else too, a calculating gleam that should have been her first warning. "That's precisely what makes you interesting." As she watched him walk away, Christabel couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous had just happened. She didn't believe in fate or destiny. Her success had come from hard work and determination, not cosmic intervention. But later, much later, she would look back on this moment and recognize it for what it was, the beginning of both a dream and a nightmare. The business card felt warm in her clutch as she continued working the room, securing donations and making connections. But her mind kept drifting back to steel-grey eyes and that challenging smile. She told herself she was only considering the dinner because of the potential benefit to her cause. She told herself she wasn't affected by his presence, his intensity, the way he'd seemed to see right through her professional facade. She told herself many things that night, all of them lies. Above the city, the stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. They had seen this story before. Ambition meeting ambition, strength meeting strength, two powerful forces drawn together like celestial bodies caught in each other's gravitational pull. They had seen how such stories usually ended too, but Christabel Morgan had never been usual, and the path she was about to embark on would change not only her life, but the lives of countless others. As she left the gala that night, the October wind whipping around her like a premonition, she couldn't have known that she was taking her first steps toward a destiny that would test every principle she held dear, every strength she'd cultivated, and every dream she'd ever dared to dream. The card in her clutch seemed to pulse with possibility and warning. Colton Sebastian, CEO, Sebastian Enterprises. Below it, in precise handwriting, he'd added his private number. It was an opening move in a game she hadn't agreed to play, but one she was already involved in. Tomorrow would bring dinner at Le Bernardin and the beginning of a story that would eventually shake Manhattan's social circles to their core. But for now, Christabel slipped into her town car, the night's success warming her like fine champagne, unaware that she had just met both her greatest love and her most dangerous adversary. The city lights blurred past her window as the car moved through the late-night traffic. Somewhere in his penthouse office, Colton Sebastian was already making plans, setting pieces in motion, and in the space between their two worlds, destiny, or perhaps something darker, was weaving their futures together with threads of gold and shadow. The stars kept their ancient vigil, watching and waiting. They had seen how these stories usually ended, yes, but they had never seen one quite like this before. And so began the tale of Christabel Morgan and Colton Sebastian. A story of love and betrayal, of power and revenge, of a woman who would rise from the ashes of heartbreak to become a force of justice, and of a man who would learn, too late, the true cost of underestimating her. But that was all still to come. For now, there was just a business card, a dinner invitation, and the dangerous allure of possibilities that hung in the air like perfume, sweet and intoxicating, and ultimately deadly. Chapter 2. A Whirlwind Romance. Le Bernardin's soft lighting cast a golden glow across the white tablecloth as Christabel arrived precisely at 7. Colton was already there, standing as she approached, his grey eyes drinking her in. She wore a fitted crimson dress that made her dark skin glow, chosen carefully to project confidence rather than seduction. This was a business dinner, she reminded herself. Nothing more. "You look stunning," he said, helping her into her chair with practiced ease. "I took the liberty of ordering the chef's tasting menu, unless you have any objections." "That depends entirely on your proposal, Mr. Sebastian," Christabel replied, unwrapping her napkin with deliberate grace. "I'm still waiting to hear how Sebastian Enterprises plans to contribute to educational equity." Colton's smile held a predatory edge that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Straight to business? Not even a glass of wine first? I find clarity of mind serves me better than wine." He laughed then, a rich sound that drew glances from nearby tables. "God, you're magnificent." All right, Ms. Morgan, let's talk business. What followed was unlike any business dinner Christabel had ever attended. Colton laid out an ambitious plan for a public-private partnership that would funnel millions into underfunded schools. His knowledge of education policy surprised her. He'd clearly done his homework. As courses appeared and disappeared, their discussion ranged from educational theory to social justice to their personal histories. Detroit housing projects to Harvard law, he mused, studying her over the rim of his wineglass. That's quite a journey. Some of us had to earn our way into the ivory tower, she countered, thinking of his own privileged background. We didn't all inherit our empires. Instead of taking offense, his eyes sparkled with interest. You've researched me. I make it a point to know who I'm dealing with. And what did you find? A man who's never lost a corporate takeover, who's known for getting exactly what he wants, through whatever means necessary. She leaned forward slightly. The question is, what do you really want from this partnership, Mr. Sebastian? He set down his glass, and for a moment, the sophisticated businessman facade slipped, revealing something raw underneath. Would you believe me if I said I wanted to make a difference? That maybe I'm tired of being the corporate raider everyone expects me to be? No, she said honestly, but I believe you're smart enough to see that social responsibility is good business these days. Their eyes locked across the table, and the air between them crackled with something that had nothing to do with business. Colton leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. Have dinner with me again tomorrow, not for business, just dinner. That would be unwise. Probably. Say yes anyway. And despite every rational argument against it, she did. What followed was 6 weeks that felt like something out of a fairy tale, if fairy tales involved private jets and boardroom battles. Their second date was at a hole-in-the-wall jazz club in Harlem, where Colton surprised her by knowing every Miles Davis album by heart. The third was an impromptu flight to Paris for lunch, just because she'd mentioned loving French Impressionism. Christabel found herself drawn into Colton's world of limitless possibility, where every whim could be indulged, every desire fulfilled. He sent rare first editions of her favorite books to her office, changed million-dollar deals to accommodate her charity events, made her laugh with wickedly accurate impressions of stuffy board members. But there were moments, brief flashes when the fairy tale flickered. The way his jaw clenched when she disagreed with him in public. How his generous donations to her causes always came with subtle strings attached. The cold calculation that sometimes replaced the warmth in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Her best friend, Maya, saw it first. Over brunch at their favorite spot in Brooklyn, while Christabel was describing another romantic gesture, Maya set down her mimosa with unusual force. He's love-bombing you, Chris. What? No, he's just generous. He's overwhelming you with grand gestures so you won't notice the red flags. Girl, you're smarter than this. But love, as Christabel was learning, had a way of making even the smartest people blind. And Colton Sebastian was a master at making his darkness look like light. When he proposed 4 months after their first meeting, he did it at the same charity gala where they'd met. Went down on one knee right after she finished her speech in front of New York's entire social elite. The ring was a flawless 10-carat diamond that must have cost millions. The moment was perfect, choreographed for maximum impact. You've changed my world, he said, looking up at her with those mesmerizing grey eyes. Marry me, Christabel. Let's change the world together. The applause was deafening. Camera flashes blinded her. Later, she would remember how his eyes had darted to the reporters before finding her face again, how his free hand had subtly guided her toward the better camera angles. But in that moment, swept up in the fairy tale, she said yes, The wedding planning became a media circus. Colton hired the most exclusive planners, insisted on the grandest venues. Every detail was scrutinized, every choice publicized. Sebastian Enterprises' stock rises as CEO's wedding approaches, the financial papers reported. Power couple sets new standards for society weddings, the society pages gushed. Christabel found herself swept along in a tide of decisions that somehow always ended up being made for her. Her simple elegance vision was transformed into an extravaganza of excess. Her desire for a small family ceremony became a 1,000-person spectacle. "It's about more than just us," Colton explained when she protested. "This is about building our brand as a couple. Think of the doors it will open for your causes." He was always so reasonable, so logical, always had a way of making his desires seem aligned with her goals. And wasn't that what partnership was about? Compromise, growth, learning to think bigger? The wedding day dawned clear and bright. New York's St. Patrick's Cathedral had never looked more magnificent, dripping with white orchids and crystal installations that caught the light like frozen rain. Christabel stood in the bride's room, stunning in a custom Vera Wang gown, while her mother fussed with her veil. "Baby," her mother said softly, "are you sure about this? Everything's happening so fast." "I'm sure, Mama," Christabel replied, checking her reflection one last time. But in the mirror, for just a moment, she caught a glimpse of something in her own eyes, a flicker of the same doubt she'd seen in Maya's, in her mother's, in the faces of friends who'd grown increasingly distant as Colton had consumed more and more of her world. Then the wedding march began, and there was no more time for doubt. She floated down the aisle on her father's arm toward the man who stood waiting like a prince from a storybook. Colton's smile was triumphant as she approached, and if it didn't quite reach his eyes, well, she was too dazzled by everything else to notice. The reception was a blur of champagne and congratulations, of dancing and toasting and perfectly staged photos for the society pages. Their first dance was to a live performance by John Legend, a surprise Colton had arranged. Everything was perfect, dreamlike, exactly as he'd planned. Later that night, in the presidential suite of the Plaza Hotel, Christabel stood at the window looking out over Central Park. Behind her, Colton was on the phone, handling some last-minute business before their honeymoon. Even on his wedding night, business came first, something that would become a pattern she was still too newlywed happy to recognize. "I love you," he said when he finally joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "You know that, right?" "I love you too," she replied, leaning back against him. They stood there in comfortable silence, looking out at the city that had brought them together. Below, the last wedding guests were departing in their luxury cars, the paparazzi finally dispersing. Tomorrow they would leave for their 3-week honeymoon in the Maldives, another perfectly planned Sebastian production. If Christabel had known then what the next few years would bring, the betrayals, the lies, the slow erosion of her independence, would she have still said yes? Perhaps. Love has a way of making us believe we can change what's broken, heal what's wounded, save what's already lost. But that understanding would come later. For now, she was Mrs. Colton Sebastian, and the fairy tale was still in full swing. The queen had her king, the lawyer had her prince, and if sometimes that prince's crown cast shadows instead of light, well, every fairy tale needs its darkness to make the happy ending shine brighter. Or so she told herself, as the New York night wrapped around them like a velvet cloak, hiding the first hairline cracks in their perfect facade. The real story, the one of power and betrayal, of a mother's love and a wife's revenge, was still to come. But its seeds were already there, planted in the soil of their whirlwind romance, waiting for the right moment to break through the surface and reveal their true nature. For now, though, There was just this moment, a new bride, a triumphant groom, and a city full of possibilities stretched out before them like a glittering promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own revelations, but tonight the fairy tale held as delicate and deceptive as a soap bubble catching the light. Beautiful, right up until the moment it bursts. Chapter 3. The First Cracks. The bathroom in the Sebastian penthouse was larger than most Manhattan apartments, all marble and gold fixtures, with a soaking tub that could fit 6 people comfortably. But at this moment, it felt suffocatingly small to Christabel as she stared at the 3 pregnancy tests lined up on the counter. All positive. Her hands trembled as she touched her flat stomach, excitement warring with an inexplicable dread. She and Colton had been married for 8 months, and while they hadn't been actively trying for a baby, they hadn't been preventing it either. Still, something held her back from immediate joy. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the penthouse. Colton was home early, unusual for him these days. Since their return from the honeymoon, he'd been increasingly absorbed in a hostile takeover of a rival tech company, often missing dinner and coming home long after she'd gone to bed. "Christabel," his voice carried through the apartment. "The doorman said you'd been ill this morning. I brought Dr. Reynolds up with me." She quickly gathered the tests, tucking them into her robe pocket. She'd wanted to tell him privately, to see his genuine reaction without an audience, but of course, Colton had already taken control of the situation, as he did with everything else. Dr. Reynolds was the Sebastian family's private physician, a silver-haired man who attended to New York's elite and was known for his discretion. He was setting up his bag in the living room when Christabel emerged. "Mrs. Sebastian," he greeted her with practiced warmth, "your husband tells me you've been experiencing morning sickness." Colton stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, still in his business suit, phone in hand as he typed rapidly. He barely glanced up as Christabel pulled the tests from her pocket. "I think I know why," she said softly. "I'm pregnant." The typing stopped. Colton's head snapped up, his grey eyes intense as he studied her face. For a moment, she saw something flash across his features, not joy, not fear, but calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by a perfect society smile. "Well," he said, crossing the room to kiss her cheek, "this calls for celebration. Doctor, would you mind confirming?" The next hour was a blur of blood draws and questions. Dr. Reynolds confirmed what Christabel already knew. She was about 6 weeks along. As he packed up his bag, he turned to Colton. "Shall I schedule the usual prenatal genetic screening? Given Mrs. Sebastian's age and background, it would be prudent." Christabel bristled at the implied racism in his tone, but Colton was already nodding. "Everything available. I want a complete picture of what we're dealing with." "What we're dealing with?" Christabel repeated once the doctor had left. "This is our child, Colton, not a corporate acquisition." He was back on his phone, barely paying attention. "Of course, darling. I just want to ensure everything is perfect. The Sebastian name carries certain expectations." Those words would echo in her mind weeks later as she lay on another examination table, this time at a high-end medical center, watching Colton's face as the genetic counselor delivered the results. "It's a girl," the counselor said brightly. "All other markers appear normal." The change in Colton's expression was subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tightened, the warmth in his eyes freezing over. Without a word, he stood and left the room, already pulling out his phone. "Don't worry," the counselor said, mistaking Christabel's devastated expression. "Some fathers just need time to adjust to the idea of a daughter. Congratulations." But Christabel wasn't worried about normal paternal adjustment. She was remembering conversations, snippets she'd dismissed before. Colton's obsession with his family legacy, his constant references to producing an heir, the way he spoke about his own sisters. relegated to minor roles in the family business while he, the only son, had inherited everything. That night, she found him in his home office, tumbler of scotch in hand, as he stared out at the city lights. She'd barely seen him since the appointment. "Are you going to talk about it?" she asked, one hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "About what?" "The fact that I've spent years building an empire that will now have to be split up or sold off because you couldn't give me a son." His voice was cold, precise, the same tone he used when destroying business rivals. Christabel felt as if she'd been slapped. "It's the 21st century, Colton. A daughter can inherit just as easily as a son." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really don't understand this world, do you? Despite all your education, all your social climbing, you're still that girl from Detroit who thinks merit matters more than bloodline. And you're still that privileged boy who thinks he can control everything, even genetics." She fought to keep her voice steady. "This baby is a blessing, regardless of gender." "A blessing?" He turned to face her, and for the first time she saw his mask completely drop. The man underneath was a stranger, cold, cruel, entitled. "Do you know what the board will say? What our competitors will think? A girl can't maintain control of Sebastian Enterprises. She'll marry, change her name, dilute the bloodline. Everything I've built, everything my father built, gone because you couldn't do the one thing you were supposed to do." The tumbler flew past her head, shattering against the wall in a spray of glass and expensive scotch. Christabel didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that showing fear only encouraged men like this. "If you ever throw something near me again," she said quietly, "I will take this baby and disappear so completely you'll never see either of us again. Do you understand?" For a moment, they stared at each other across the dark office. Power versus power, will versus will. Finally, Colton's face smoothed back into its usual pleasant mask. "I apologize," he said, straightening his tie. "I've had too much to drink. We'll discuss this another time." But there was no real discussion in the months that followed, only a growing distance. Colton threw himself into work, often sleeping in his office downtown. When he was home, he ignored her growing belly, changed the subject whenever she tried to talk about the baby. The nursery planning was left entirely to her. He didn't even ask to see the room. Christabel found herself increasingly isolated. Her old friends had mostly fallen away during the whirlwind courtship and marriage, put off by Colton's controlling nature and her own willing submission to it. Her mother's calls went unanswered when Colton was home. He'd never approved of her common background. Even Maya, her closest friend, had stopped trying after Colton had her blacklisted from their social circle for suggesting he was manipulative. The loneliness was suffocating. She took to talking to her unborn daughter during long baths, promising her a life full of love and opportunity, swearing that she would never let anyone make her feel less than perfect. But in the dark hours of the night, when the baby's kicks kept her awake, doubt crept in like a poison. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered down to Colton's office. He was working late again, but she needed some files from his desk for an upcoming foundation meeting. As she searched through the drawers, she found a journal, expensive leather, hand-tooled with the Sebastian family crest. She shouldn't have opened it. Later, she would tell herself that if she'd just resisted that urge, things might have been different. But she did open it, and there, in Colton's precise handwriting, was the truth she'd been avoiding. The merger with CM was perfect on paper, impeccable credentials, right social standing, strong enough to produce healthy heirs, but naive enough to be controlled. The pregnancy is an unfortunate setback. A girl changes everything, must consult lawyers about potential prenup loopholes. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She was never a love match. She was a merger, an acquisition, a carefully selected broodmare for the Sebastian bloodline. Every romantic gesture, every seeming coincidence, every perfect moment had been calculated and choreographed. She was still standing there, journal in hand, when Colton walked in. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all pretense fell away. She saw him clearly for the first time, not as the prince from her fairy tale, but as the predator he'd always been. "You should be in bed," he said mildly, but his eyes were fixed on the journal. "You should be in hell," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. He moved toward her, hand outstretched for the journal, but stopped when she held up her phone, showing the photos she'd already taken of the most damning pages. "If anything happens to me or this baby," she said quietly, "these go to every media outlet in the country. How would the board react to seeing Sebastian Enterprises' CEO plotting his wife's acquisition like a hostile takeover?" A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign that she'd scored a hit. "You're being hormonal," he said dismissively. "We'll discuss this in the morning." But there would be no more discussions, no more pretending. As she walked past him, head high despite her breaking heart, Christabel felt her daughter kick, strong and fierce, already a fighter. In that moment she made a silent vow. This child would never know the pain of being seen as less than perfect. She would be loved, protected, cherished, even if Christabel had to fight the whole world to ensure it. Starting with the man who should have loved them both, but saw them only as pawns in his grand design. The cracks in their marriage had become chasms, too wide to bridge, too deep to ignore. But Christabel was no longer the starry-eyed bride who believed in fairy tales. She was becoming something else, something stronger, harder, more dangerous. She just didn't know yet how much she would need that strength in the months to come. Chapter 4. Little Angel Thunder crashed outside Mount Sinai Hospital's VIP wing as Christabel gripped the edges of her birthing bed, sweat beading on her forehead. The contractions had started 18 hours ago, and despite the best efforts of New York's most expensive medical team, her daughter seemed in no hurry to make her appearance. "Where is he?" she gasped between contractions, though she already knew the answer. Colton was supposed to be flying back from a business meeting in Dubai, but his private jet had been suspiciously delayed. Again and again. "I've left 3 more messages," her mother said, wiping Christabel's brow with a cool cloth. Regina Morgan had flown in from Detroit the moment her daughter went into labor, despite Colton's obvious disapproval of her common presence in his carefully curated world. "Baby girl, you focus on bringing my grandbaby into this world. That man ain't worth your worry right now." Another contraction ripped through her body, and Christabel screamed through clenched teeth. The pain was primal, overwhelming, but there was something else too, a fierce determination that had been growing stronger throughout her pregnancy. Each contraction brought her daughter closer, and with her, a new kind of strength Christabel hadn't known she possessed. "Mrs. Sebastian," Dr. Reynolds said from between her legs, his usual aristocratic manner somewhat ruffled by the lengthy labor. "I can see the head. One more big push." Christabel bore down with everything she had, her mother's hand nearly crushed in her grip. The room filled with the sound of her effort, of machines beeping, of medical staff encouraging her, and then, cutting through it all, a new sound. Her daughter's first angry cry. "She's here," Dr. Reynolds announced, lifting the baby. "Time of birth, 3:47 a.m. But his voice trailed off as he got his first good look at the infant. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before the nurses quickly whisked the baby away for cleaning and assessment. "What's wrong?" Christabel demanded, trying to sit up. "Why isn't anyone saying anything? Let me see my baby." The medical team exchanged glances, a silent communication that made her heart race. Finally, one of the nurses approached with a bundled blanket. "Your daughter is perfectly healthy, Mrs. Sebastian. She's just..." She has a birthmark, a rather large port wine stain. Christabel reached for her daughter with trembling hands. As the blanket fell away, she saw it, a dark red birthmark that covered nearly half of the baby's face, spreading from her left temple down to her chin like a splash of wine on silk. But to Christabel, it didn't matter. All she saw was perfection. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and eyes that, when they finally opened, were the exact shade of grey as her father's. "She's beautiful," Christabel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My perfect little angel." "Have you decided on a name?" the nurse asked, clipboard ready. "Zara," Christabel said firmly. "Zara Regina Sebastian." She'd chosen the name months ago. Zara for the princess warrior of African legend, Regina for her mother who had taught her to be strong. Colton had shown no interest in discussing names, so she'd made the decision alone. The next few hours were a blur of tests and paperwork, of learning to nurse and counting tiny toes over and over again. Regina stayed by her side, cooing at her granddaughter and shooting worried glances at her daughter when she thought Christabel wasn't looking. It was nearly noon when Colton finally arrived. He strode into the room in a perfectly pressed suit, phone to his ear, arguing about stock options. Christabel watched his face as he got his first look at his daughter, saw the exact moment his expression shifted from disinterest to barely concealed horror. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, ending the call. "What's wrong with it?" "Her," Christabel corrected sharply. "And nothing is wrong with her. She's perfect." Colton moved closer, his face a mask of disgust as he studied the birthmark. "Perfect? She looks like she's been branded. Have you seen what she looks like?" Regina stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "I think you need to step outside and remember who you're talking about, Mr. Sebastian. That's your daughter." "Mother, please," Christabel said quietly. "Could you give us a moment?" Regina hesitated, but years of respecting her daughter's independence won out. She kissed Zara's forehead, deliberately right on the birthmark, and left the room with one final glare at Colton. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Zara slept peacefully in Christabel's arms, unaware of the storm brewing around her. Finally, Colton spoke, his voice cold and precise. "This is unacceptable. I've already contacted Dr. Steinberg. He's the best plastic surgeon on the East Coast. We'll start the procedures as soon as she's old enough." "No." The word came out stronger than Christabel expected. "She doesn't need fixing. She's not broken." "Don't be ridiculous," Colton snapped. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our social standing? To the company's image? Sebastian children are supposed to be perfect. She is perfect. The only imperfection in this room is your soul." His laugh was cruel, cutting. "How poetic. And how like you to turn this into some moral crusade. This isn't about your bleeding heart ideals, Christabel. This is about maintaining the standards that come with the Sebastian name. Standards you clearly failed to meet." "Failed to meet?" Christabel's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm. "I carried her for 9 months, while you pretended we didn't exist. I labored for 18 hours while you conveniently got delayed in Dubai. I have loved her every second of her existence, while you've been plotting how to hide her away like some shameful secret. The only failure here is yours." Colton's face hardened, and for a moment she saw the mask slip completely, saw the cold, calculating monster beneath the polished exterior. "Let me be very clear," he said, leaning close. "That child will have the surgery. She will be fixed. And if you fight me on this, I will make sure you never see her again. Remember your prenup, darling. In the event of a divorce, Sebastian children stay with the Sebastian name." Before Christabel could respond, Zara stirred and began to cry, a sound that would normally send any new father's heart soaring. But Colton just straightened his tie and stepped back, lip curling in distaste. "Have the nurse contact Dr. Steinberg's office," he said, already pulling out his phone. "I have a board meeting to attend." He left without touching his daughter, without even a second glance. As soon as the door closed behind him, Christabel broke down, her tears falling onto Zara's blanket as she held her daughter close. "I'm so sorry, my love," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I chose him to be your father. But I promise you this, he will never hurt you, never make you feel less than the perfect miracle you are. I will protect you with everything I have." Regina came back in, took one look at her daughter's face, and understood everything. She settled into the chair beside the bed, reaching out to stroke Zara's tiny hand. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "your father wasn't exactly thrilled when you were born either. Said you were too dark, wanted to know if you'd get lighter. You know what I did?" Christabel shook her head, still fighting tears. "I told him he could either love you exactly as God made you, or he could get out. Simple as that." Regina's eyes hardened. "Seems to me some men need to learn that lesson more than once." "It's not that simple, Mama. The prenup, baby girl." "Let me tell you something about prenups and powerful men," Regina interrupted. "They only work if you play by their rules. And it seems to me you've got something a lot stronger than a prenup now." She nodded at Zara. "You've got a reason to break every damn rule they ever wrote." As if in agreement, Zara opened her eyes. Those startling grey eyes that somehow looked softer, warmer in her little face than they ever had in her father's. She gazed up at her mother with complete trust, complete love, and in that moment something shifted inside Christabel. She thought about the journal she'd found during her pregnancy, about Colton's calculated pursuit and cruel dismissal. She thought about all the other women he'd probably done this to before her, all the lives he'd casually destroyed in his pursuit of the perfect heir. She thought about her daughter growing up in that cold world of impossible standards and conditional love. "You're right, Mama," she said quietly, a new steel in her voice. "It's time to break some rules." Over the next few days, as Christabel recovered and Zara grew stronger, she began to plan. She documented everything. Every cruel comment Colton made, every missed pediatrician appointment, every time he refused to hold or even look at his daughter. She recorded conversations on her phone, kept meticulous notes, and started moving money into accounts he couldn't access. The nurses on the maternity ward watched with a mixture of sympathy and admiration as the famous Mrs. Sebastian transformed from society bride to protective lioness. They saw how she never let Zara out of her sight, how she researched birthmarks and support groups instead of plastic surgeons, how she stood up straighter every time Colton swept through for his brief, disdainful visits. On their last day in the hospital, as Christabel was preparing to take Zara home, the head nurse pulled her aside. "Mrs. Sebastian," she said quietly, "I've been doing this job for 30 years. I've seen all kinds of families, all kinds of situations, and I want you to know, that baby girl is lucky to have you. Some marks are beauty marks, no matter what anyone else says. And some marks—" She glanced meaningfully at the bruise on Christabel's wrist where Colton had grabbed her during their last argument. "Some marks are warnings we should heed." Christabel looked down at her sleeping daughter, at the birthmark that Colton saw as a flaw, but she saw as just another part of her perfect child. Then she looked at her own wrist, at the evidence of what happened when you ignored the warning signs, when you let love blind you to cruelty. "Yes," she said softly, "some marks are warnings, and I'm done ignoring them." That night, as she sat in Zara's nursery, the one room in the penthouse Colton refused to enter, Christabel made a decision. She would play his game for now, be the perfect society wife he'd purchased, but she would also prepare, gather evidence, build her strength. And when the time came, when he least expected it, she would show him exactly what happened when you underestimated a mother's love, let him think he had all the power, let him believe his money and his name and his precious prenup made him invincible. He'd learn soon enough that some things were stronger than legal documents and social standing. Some things, like a mother's determination to protect her child, could break any chains, overcome any obstacle. Zara stirred in her crib, making those tiny baby sounds that made Christabel's heart swell with love. She lifted her daughter, kissing the birthmark that had become a battle line between two worlds. Colton's world of superficial perfection and her world of unconditional love. "Sweet dreams, my little warrior," she whispered. "Mommy's here, and Mommy's going to change the world for you." Outside the nursery window, the New York skyline glittered like 1,000 promises. Somewhere in that concrete jungle, Colton Sebastian was probably in his office, plotting his next business conquest, unaware that in his own home a revolution was brewing. A revolution sparked by a tiny girl with a wine-colored birthmark and the mother who would move heaven and earth to protect her. Chapter 5. Enter the Snake. The Sebastian Enterprises boardroom was all gleaming mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows 40 stories above Manhattan. Christabel sat at her usual place beside Colton's empty chair, reviewing the merger documents for the company's latest acquisition. As head of the corporate foundation and de facto face of Sebastian Enterprises' social responsibility initiatives, she attended these meetings more out of obligation than necessity. At 34, she had settled into a careful routine over the past 2 years since Zara's birth. She maintained her public role as the perfect corporate wife, while quietly building her own power base through charitable works and strategic alliances. If Colton noticed her growing influence in New York's social circles, he never mentioned it. They barely spoke these days, except at public functions. The boardroom door opened, and Christabel looked up, expecting to see her husband. Instead, a young woman entered, tall, slim, with the kind of ethereal blonde beauty that seemed almost calculated in its perfection. She wore a red designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her smile held the same predatory edge Christabel remembered from Colton's early courtship. "Oh, I'm sorry," the woman said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "I thought the meeting had started. I'm Cordelia Pierce, from Pierce Technologies." Christabel's grip on her pen tightened imperceptibly. Pierce Technologies was the company they were acquiring, or rather devouring, in typical Sebastian Enterprises fashion. But this woman wasn't mentioned in any of the briefing documents. "Christabel Sebastian," she replied coolly. "I wasn't aware Pierce Technologies was sending a representative to this meeting. Daddy thought it would be good for me to learn the family business from the inside," Cordelia said, sliding into a chair directly across from Christabel. "And Mr. Sebastian was kind enough to agree." The way she said Mr. Sebastian set off warning bells in Christabel's mind. There was an intimacy in her tone, a subtle emphasis that spoke volumes. Before she could probe further, the boardroom began filling with executives, Colton among them. "Ah, Ms. Pierce." Colton's face lit up with a warmth Christabel hadn't seen in years. "I trust you found the boardroom without difficulty?" "Your secretary was very helpful," Cordelia replied, batting eyes that probably took an hour to make look that effortlessly perfect. Throughout the meeting, Christabel observed the subtle dance between her husband and the Pierce heiress. Every laugh was a little too bright, every glance held a little too long. She recognized the choreography. She'd been part of it herself once, though she'd been too blinded by love to see it for the performance it was. After the meeting, she cornered Colton in his office. "Care to explain why Pierce's daughter is suddenly part of our merger team?" "It's good business," he replied, without looking up from his computer. "Having her involved smooths the transition, makes the acquisition seem less hostile. And I suppose her looking like a supermodel has nothing to do with it." That got his attention. He looked up, a cold smile playing at his lips. Careful, darling. Jealousy doesn't become you. Neither does being made a fool of in my own boardroom. Our boardroom, he corrected sharply. And might I remind you that your position here is courtesy of our marriage. Don't overstep. The threat was clear, but Christabel had learned to play this game too well to show fear. Just remember, dear husband, that courtesy works both ways. Over the next few weeks, Cordelia Pierce became an increasingly constant presence at Sebastian Enterprises. She had an office now, just down the hall from Colton's. Her youth and beauty made her a favorite with the old guard of the board, who seemed to forget she was supposedly there to learn the business, not to decorate it. Christabel watched it all with growing unease. She recognized the pattern, the late meetings, the business dinners, the increasingly transparent excuses, but this time she was clear-eyed enough to see the manipulation behind every move. One evening, as she sat in Zara's room reading bedtime stories, her phone buzzed with a message from Maya, one of the few friends she'd managed to keep, despite Colton's disapproval. It was a photo taken at Le Bernardin, their old date spot. In it, Colton and Cordelia sat at a corner table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that couldn't be mistaken for business. "Thought you should know," Maya's message read. "He's not even trying to hide it anymore." Christabel looked at her daughter, peacefully drawing in her favorite coloring book. At 2, Zara was already showing signs of remarkable intelligence, and her birthmark had faded slightly, though it was still prominent. She'd inherited her father's sharp grey eyes, but thankfully none of his cruelty. "Mommy," Zara looked up from her drawing. "Why are you sad?" "I'm not sad, baby." Christabel forced a smile. "I'm just thinking." "About Daddy?" "He doesn't come read stories anymore." The simple observation cut deeper than any of Colton's calculated insults. "Daddy's very busy with work, sweetheart." "With the pretty lady?" "I saw them in his office." She laughed really loud. Christabel's blood ran cold. "When was this, baby?" "Yesterday. Maria took me to see Daddy, but his door was closed. The pretty lady was there. She doesn't have any marks on her face. Like me." Fighting back tears of rage, Christabel pulled her daughter close. "Your mark is beautiful, Zara. It shows how special you are. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." After putting Zara to bed, Christabel sat in her home office, scrolling through her phone. There were more photos, Colton and Cordelia at charity galas, business functions, restaurants. The gossip blogs were already speculating about trouble in the Sebastian marriage. She opened her laptop and began to research. Cordelia Pierce, 26, daughter of Pierce Technologies founder. Graduated from Yale with middling grades, but exceptional social connections. No real business experience, but a history of attaching herself to powerful men at convenient moments. A notification popped up on her screen, a credit card alert. Colton had just charged a $50,000 purchase at Cartier. Their anniversary wasn't for months, and he hadn't bought her jewelry since before Zara's birth. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture she'd been avoiding. History was repeating itself, but this time she wasn't the naive target. She was the inconvenient wife being pushed aside for a newer model. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Maya, this time with a link to a blind item on a gossip site. Which high-powered CEO is planning to trade in his society wife for a younger model? Sources say the prenup is ironclad, and the wife's recent focus on motherhood has left her vulnerable. Christabel closed her laptop, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. She walked to her closet, pushing aside designer dresses until she found the hidden safe behind them. Inside was the journal she'd discovered during her pregnancy, Colton's detailed account of their courtship, proving it had all been a calculated business move. Next to it was a USB drive containing everything she'd documented since Zara's birth. Every cruel comment, every missed milestone, every business meeting that was actually a rendezvous. She'd been building her case quietly, methodically, waiting for the right moment. Now, watching her husband fall into the same patterns with a younger woman, she realized she'd been preparing for this all along. Colton thought he was orchestrating another perfect acquisition, but he'd forgotten one crucial detail. This time, his target wasn't just another business asset. She was a mother protecting her child's future. The next morning, Christabel dressed with extra care. A white Tom Ford suit that emphasized her flawless figure, Louboutin heels that put her eye level with most men in the office. She swept into Sebastian Enterprises like she owned it, which, technically, she partly did. Cordelia was already there, perched on the edge of Colton's desk in a dress that barely met corporate standards. She jumped up when Christabel entered, but not quickly enough. "Mrs. Sebastian, I was just discussing the merger." "Of course you were," Christabel cut her off smoothly. "I wonder, though, does your father know you're sleeping with the man who's about to destroy his company?" The younger woman's perfect complexion went pale. "I don't know what you're—" "Please," Christabel held up a hand, "spare us both the performance. You're not the first young woman Colton has used to facilitate a hostile takeover. Though I must admit, you're playing the role beautifully. The dress, the laugh, the wide-eyed ingenue act. It's all very convincing. I should know. I wrote the original script." "You don't understand," Cordelia started, but Christabel was already walking away. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she called over her shoulder. "I just wonder if you do. Let them think she was the scorned wife, too blinded by jealousy to see their master plan. Let them believe she was weakened by motherhood, distracted by charity work, trapped by the prenup. They'd learn soon enough that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one they thought they'd already caught." That night, as she helped Zara with her bedtime routine, Christabel received another credit card alert. Colton had booked a suite at the Four Seasons, his favorite spot for business meetings. "Mommy," Zara asked as Christabel tucked her in, "can we go to the park tomorrow?" The pretty lady said Daddy's too busy to take me anymore. Christabel kissed her daughter's forehead, right on the birthmark that Colton saw as such a flaw. "Of course we can, baby. And you know what? Soon, we're going to make sure Daddy is never too busy for you again." She turned off the light, leaving the door cracked just how Zara liked it. In her office, the laptop screen glowed with dozens of open tabs, bank records, surveillance photos, transcripts of recordings. 2 years of careful documentation of playing the perfect wife while preparing for this moment. Colton thought he was orchestrating another masterful acquisition. He didn't realize he was actually setting the stage for his own downfall. And Cordelia. She was about to learn that there were worse things than a hostile takeover. There was a mother's revenge. Chapter 6. The Perfect Storm. The anonymous email arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as Christabel was finishing a conference call with her foundation's board. The subject line was simple: "Thought you should know." The attachments, however, were anything but simple. Dozens of photos cascaded across her screen. Colton and Cordelia in various states of intimacy. At the Ritz in Paris, where he'd claimed to be negotiating a deal. On his yacht in the Mediterranean, her blonde hair gleaming in the sunset. In their own Hamptons beach house, where he'd once promised to take Zara for the summer, but never had. The final photo stopped her heart. Cordelia trying on what was unmistakably an engagement ring at Cartier, Colton's hand possessively on her waist. The timestamp was from yesterday. "Mrs. Sebastian," her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Sebastian's office called. He won't be attending Zara's pediatrician appointment this afternoon. He has an urgent business meeting." Of course he did. The same kind of urgent business meeting that had kept him from their daughter's first steps, first words, and every major milestone since her birth. "Thank you, Andrea. Please clear my schedule for the rest of the day." Christabel closed her laptop with trembling hands. She'd known this was coming, had been preparing for it even. But knowing a storm is approaching doesn't make it any less devastating when it finally hits. The pediatrician's office was on the Upper East Side, its waiting room filled with Manhattan's elite and their perfectly groomed offspring. Zara sat quietly beside her, coloring in a book about brave princesses. At 2.5, she was already showing signs of her mother's quiet strength and resilience. Mrs. Sebastian, a nurse, appeared, her face concerned. Dr. Harrison would like to discuss some test results. Perhaps it would be better if Zara waited here with our child life specialist. Christabel's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. Of course. Sweetheart, will you stay here and finish your picture? Mommy needs to talk to the doctor for a minute. Zara nodded, too absorbed in her coloring to notice her mother's anxiety. The child life specialist, a kind-faced woman named Jenny, sat down beside her with a fresh box of crayons. Dr. Harrison's office was warm and welcoming, but nothing could soften the blow of his words. The blood work shows some concerning abnormalities, he explained, pointing to various highlighted numbers on the report. Combined with her recent symptoms, the fatigue, the unexplained bruising, I'm recommending an immediate referral to Dr. Chen at Memorial Sloan Kettering. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Are you suggesting we need to rule out several possibilities? Dr. Harrison said gently. Dr. Chen is the best pediatric hematologist-oncologist in the city. She'll be able to give us more definitive answers. Christabel's phone buzzed. Another email notification. Without thinking, she glanced at it. More photos, this time of Colton and Cordelia entering a prestigious private school on the Upper East Side. The same school where he'd adamantly refused to enroll Zara, claiming her birthmark would disturb the other children. Mrs. Sebastian? Dr. Harrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. Would you like me to have someone call your husband? No, she said sharply, then forced herself to soften her tone. No, thank you. I'll handle that myself. But when she tried calling Colton's private line, it went straight to voicemail. His secretary was unable to disturb him in his very important meeting. Even his driver, usually reliably discreet, seemed uncomfortable when he admitted that he'd dropped Mr. Sebastian and Ms. Pierce at the Four Seasons an hour ago. Back in the waiting room, Zara had fallen asleep on Jenny's lap, her beloved coloring book clutched to her chest. The sight of her daughter, so small, so precious, so completely failed by her father, broke something deep inside Christabel. She made the appointment with Dr. Chen for the next morning, gathered her sleeping daughter, and headed home to their penthouse. But as the elevator rose to the top floor, she knew she couldn't face those white walls and empty rooms. Not tonight. Instead, she redirected the elevator to the garage, strapped Zara into her car seat, and drove through the gathering dusk to her mother's brownstone in Harlem. Regina Morgan took one look at her daughter's face and opened her arms without a word. Later, after Zara was tucked into her grandmother's guest room, Christabel sat in the warm, familiar kitchen and finally let the tears come. "He's going to leave us, Mama," she whispered. "He's already got it all planned out. And now Zara's sick. And I don't know if—" "Stop right there!" Regina's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "That baby girl needs you strong right now. And as for Colton Sebastian, let him try to leave. See how far he gets when the world finds out he abandoned his sick child for a woman young enough to be his daughter. The prenup. To hell with his prenup." Regina slapped her hand on the kitchen table. "You think a piece of paper is stronger than a mother's love, than a grandmother's fury. Baby girl, it's time to stop playing by his rules." Christabel wiped her eyes, her mother's words igniting something that had been smoldering inside her for months. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. "Maya? I need your help. Remember those files we discussed? It's time." Maya had been her best friend since law school, and more importantly, she was now a partner at one of New York's most ruthless divorce firms. She'd been quietly building a case file for months, just waiting for Christabel's signal. About damn time, Maya replied. I've got everything ready. But Chris, are you sure you want to do this? Once we start, there's no going back. Christabel thought of the photos in her email, of Colton and Cordelia shopping for schools while her own daughter was facing God knew what kind of illness, of all the missed birthdays and ignored milestones. I'm sure, she said firmly, but we need to move fast. Things with Zara, they've gotten complicated. She could almost hear Maya sitting up straighter. What kind of complicated? The kind that's going to make Colton Sebastian the most hated man in New York when the press finds out he was house hunting with his mistress while his daughter was in the hospital. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Come to my office first thing tomorrow. Bring everything you've got. And Christabel, make sure you've got somewhere safe to go. Men like Colton, they don't take kindly to losing control. After hanging up, Christabel sat in her mother's kitchen for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood through the open window. A lifetime ago, she'd thought Colton's world of penthouses and private jets was better than this. Now she knew better. Her phone buzzed one final time, another anonymous email. This one contained a single photo, Colton and Cordelia leaving Tiffany's, her left hand conspicuously hidden from view. The subject line read, Wedding set for spring. Better move fast. Upstairs, Zara coughed in her sleep, a sound that seemed to echo through the quiet house. Christabel clutched her phone, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palm. First thing tomorrow, she'd take her baby to see Dr. Chen. She'd find out exactly what they were facing, what kind of battle lay ahead. And then she'd show Colton Sebastian exactly what happened when you backed a mother into a corner. Let him plan his spring wedding. Let him shop for schools with his blonde trophy. Let him think he had it all under control. The perfect storm was coming, and he'd never see it until it was too late. In her grandmother's guest room, Zara slept peacefully, unaware of the gathering storm clouds. Her birthmark seemed to glow softly in the streetlight filtering through the window, the mark Colton saw as a flaw, but had actually been a blessing in disguise. It had shown Christabel his true nature, before it was too late, had prepared her for this moment when everything would change. Tomorrow would bring hospitals and tests, lawyers and strategies. But tonight, in her mother's warm kitchen, Christabel Sebastian began to transform from society wife to avenging angel. And somewhere in a luxury hotel suite, Colton Sebastian slept beside his young mistress, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The perfect storm was gathering force, and not even the mighty Colton Sebastian would be able to control its fury. Chapter 7. A Mother's Nightmare. Memorial Sloan. Kettering's pediatric wing was a world of gentle colors and forced cheer, where nurses spoke in hushed tones and parents wore their fear like armor. Christabel sat in Dr. Chen's office, her back straight as steel, while the renowned pediatric specialist delivered the news that would shatter her world. The blood work confirms our initial concerns, Dr. Chen said, her voice gentle but direct. Zara has a rare form of autoimmune disease that's affecting her blood cells. Without immediate intervention, her condition will continue to deteriorate rapidly. Christabel's fingers dug into the arms of her chair, but her voice remained steady. What kind of intervention? There's an experimental treatment protocol showing promising results in cases like Zara's. It combines targeted immunotherapy with stem cell transplantation. Dr. Chen hesitated. However, the treatment is still in clinical trials. The cost... Money is not an issue, Christabel interrupted. After all, she was still Mrs. Colton Sebastian, at least for now. What are the success rates? As Dr. Chen outlined the statistics and procedures, Christabel's phone buzzed repeatedly in her bag, Colton's office trying to reach her. She'd left urgent messages about Zara's condition, but he'd been unavailable all morning. Now, apparently, he had time. We'll need both parents' consent to proceed, Dr. Chen was saying. Given Zara's age and the experimental nature of the treatment. Her father will sign, Christabel said, with a confidence she didn't feel. How soon can we start? The sooner the better. I'd like to admit Zara today, begin preliminary treatments while we process the insurance and trial paperwork. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Sebastian, I need you to understand. This won't be easy. The treatment is aggressive. Zara will need every ounce of strength she has, and she'll need both parents' support. Both parents. Christabel almost laughed at the irony. Instead, she stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. I'll get her father here. Today. But when she stepped out of Dr. Chen's office, her phone showed a text from Maya. Turn on TMZ now. Heart-pounding, Christabel pulled up the gossip site on her phone. The headline made her blood run cold. Sebastian Enterprises CEO spotted ring shopping with mystery blonde. Sources say divorce imminent. The accompanying photos showed Colton and Cordelia leaving Harry Winston, both laughing, her hand sporting what appeared to be a massive diamond. The timestamp was from this morning, while she'd been sitting in a doctor's office, learning their daughter might die. Mrs. Sebastian? A nurse appeared, concern etched on her face. Zara's asking for you. She's in the playroom with our child life specialist. Christabel locked her phone, tucking away her rage behind the mask of calm she'd perfected over years of society functions. In the cheerful pediatric playroom, Zara sat at a tiny table, her dark curls bouncing as she colored. The birthmark that Colton so despised seemed more pronounced against her increasingly pale skin. "Mommy!" Zara looked up with a smile that made Christabel's heart crack. "Look what I drew." The picture showed three figures: a tall woman in what was clearly a business suit, a small girl with a red mark on her face, and a man standing far away in the corner. Even in crayon, the emotion was clear. "It's beautiful, baby," Christabel managed, her voice only slightly choked. "Hey, how about we have a little sleepover here at the hospital? They have special beds and lots of nice doctors who want to help you feel better." Zara's smile faltered. "Is Daddy coming? I'm going to call him right now." Christabel kissed her daughter's forehead. "You keep coloring with Miss Jenny, okay?" In the hallway, she finally returned Colton's calls. He answered on the first ring. "Where the hell are you?" he demanded. "We have the Pierce Technologies board meeting in an hour. I'm at Memorial Sloan Kettering," she said coldly. "Our daughter is being admitted today. She needs immediate medical intervention." There was a pause, then, "What's wrong with her now?" Another cold. "Really, Christabel, you can't keep disrupting business because you're an overprotective—" "She has a life-threatening autoimmune condition," Christabel cut him off. "The doctors need your consent for experimental treatment. It's urgent." Another pause. She could hear Cordelia's voice in the background, asking something about lunch reservations. "I'm in the middle of a crucial merger," Colton said finally. "Have them email the forms to my assistant. I'll look at them when I have time." "When you have time," Christabel's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm. "Your daughter is seriously ill and you're too busy with your mistress to come to the hospital? Don't be dramatic. And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop spreading malicious rumors about Cordelia. She's a valued business associate." "Is that what they're calling it these days? Tell me, do all your valued business associates go ring shopping with you at Harry Winston?" She heard his sharp intake of breath, followed by a door closing, presumably moving somewhere private. "You're becoming hysterical," he said, his voice taking on the cold, precise tone she'd come to dread. "Perhaps all this maternal stress is affecting your judgment. Remember your position, Christabel. Remember who pays for Zara's medical care." The threat was clear. Play nice, or the money stops. Accept the humiliation, or watch their daughter suffer. "The doctors need to see you in person," she said, forcing her voice to stay level. "It's hospital policy for experimental treatments. They need to explain the risks, get witness consent." She could practically hear him calculating, weighing the optics of refusing against the inconvenience. "Fine. I'll stop by this evening. Late, after the board meeting." "Thank you," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. After hanging up, she slumped against the wall, fighting back tears of rage and fear. A gentle touch on her arm made her start. "Mrs. Sebastian." It was Jenny, the child life specialist. "Zara's asking for her favorite book, something about a warrior princess. She said it's in her room at home." Home. The penthouse hadn't felt like home in years, but Zara's room was her sanctuary. "I'll have our housekeeper bring it." "Of course." And Mrs. Sebastian. Children are remarkably resilient, sometimes more so than their parents. Christabel managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Jenny, for everything." The rest of the day passed in a blur of admission paperwork, medical histories, and preliminary tests. Zara remained remarkably brave through it all, only crying once when they had to draw blood. By evening, she was settled in a private room, surrounded by stuffed animals their housekeeper had brought from home, along with her beloved books. "When is Daddy coming?" she asked as Christabel tucked her in, her small voice heavy with sleep. "Soon, baby, very soon." But 9 o'clock came and went, then 10, then 11. Christabel's calls went straight to voicemail. Finally, near midnight, a text. "Board meeting ran late. Will try to stop by tomorrow. Having my assistant review the consent forms." Christabel stared at the message until the words blurred. Then she opened her browser and typed TMZ live updates. The newest post, time-stamped 10:47 p.m., showed Colton and Cordelia leaving Le Bernardin, her sporting not just an engagement ring now, but a complete diamond set. The caption read, "Sebastian's Valentine's Day dinner turns into impromptu engagement celebration. Sources say the couple couldn't wait to share their happy news." Valentine's Day. She'd been so consumed with Zara's illness, she'd forgotten the date, forgotten how Colton had always made a show of it during their marriage, at least in the beginning. Now he was celebrating with his mistress while their daughter lay in a hospital bed. Something snapped inside Christabel. She opened her phone's recording app and began to speak, her voice low and clear. "February 14th, 2024. Time 12:03 a.m. Location, Memorial Sloan Kettering Pediatric Wing. This is Christabel Sebastian, documenting my husband Colton Sebastian's continued neglect and abandonment of our daughter, Zara Sebastian, aged 2 years and 7 months. She recorded everything, the diagnosis, the missed appointments, the refused calls, the engagement photos. Then she forwarded the file to Maya, along with a simple message. "I'm done waiting. Start the proceedings." In her hospital bed, Zara stirred fitfully. Christabel moved to her side, stroking her curls until she settled. A nurse paused in the doorway during rounds, her face softening at the sight. "She's lucky to have such a devoted mother," the nurse said quietly. "Lucky." Christabel almost laughed. What kind of luck gave a child a father who could celebrate his engagement to another woman while she lay sick in a hospital? What kind of luck was it to be born with a birthmark that made your own father reject you? But looking at her sleeping daughter's face, Christabel realized the nurse was right, just not in the way she meant. Zara was lucky because her mother had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. Lucky because Christabel had learned from Colton's own playbook how to gather evidence, build alliances, and strike when the enemy least expected it. Most of all, Zara was lucky because her mother had finally reached her breaking point, and a woman with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous opponent of all. Her phone buzzed again, another text from Colton. Don't do anything rash. Remember the prenup. Remember who has the power here." Christabel looked at her sleeping daughter, then at the bank of medical equipment, keeping track of her vital signs. Each beep was a reminder of what really mattered, what she was really fighting for. She typed back a single word: watch. Then she opened her contacts and began to make calls. To Maya, to her mother, to carefully cultivated allies in the press and social circles, to board members who owed her favors, to charity directors who knew the real story behind Sebastian Enterprises' philanthropy. Let Colton celebrate with his trophy blonde. Let him think his prenup and his money made him untouchable. Let him believe he could discard his wife and sick child without consequences. The storm she'd been preparing for was finally here. And when it broke, it would wash away everything Colton Sebastian had built, leaving him with nothing but the ashes of his own cruelty. In her hospital bed, Zara slept on, unaware that her mother was setting in motion events that would change their lives forever. The medical machines beeped steadily, marking time like a countdown to destruction. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more treatments, more battles for Zara's health. But tonight, in the quiet of a hospital room, Christabel Sebastian declared war. And she had no intention of losing. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. The private suite at Memorial Sloan Kettering cost more per night than most Manhattan apartments, but its luxurious furnishings couldn't mask the clinical reality of what was happening within its walls. Christabel sat in the window seat, watching dawn break over the city, while monitoring machines tracked her daughter's vital signs with steady, rhythmic beeps. Zara had finally fallen asleep after a night of fever and pain, side effects of the preliminary treatments they'd started. Her small body seemed lost in the hospital bed, dark curls splayed across the pillow, birthmarks stark against her too pale skin. Christabel's phone buzzed with another news alert. She'd been avoiding them, but this one made her breath catch. Breaking, Sebastian Enterprises CEO announces engagement at charity gala, mystery blonde revealed as Pierce Technologies' heiress. The accompanying photo showed Colton and Cordelia on the red carpet at last night's children's cancer benefit, the irony of which made Christabel's blood boil. Cordelia sparkled in a designer gown, prominently displaying what appeared to be a 15-carat diamond ring. Colton beamed beside her with the practiced smile Christabel now recognized as pure performance. "Another busy night for your father," she murmured to her sleeping child. "Too busy to visit his sick daughter, but not too busy to announce his engagement to the woman he's been cheating with." A soft knock at the door interrupted her bitter thoughts. Maya entered, carrying 2 cups of real coffee, not the hospital's weak excuse for caffeine, and a thick manila envelope. "I came as soon as I got your message," her friend said, setting the coffee and envelope down. "How is she?" "Fever finally broke around dawn. The doctors say that's normal with this treatment protocol, but—" Christabel's voice cracked slightly. Maya squeezed her hand. "And how are you holding up?" "I'm fine." "Bullshit. I saw the news. That bastard really did it. Announced his engagement while his daughter's in the hospital. Please tell me you're ready to let me destroy him." Christabel picked up the manila envelope. "What's this?" "Everything we need to blow his perfect world apart. Financial records showing suspicious transfers to offshore accounts. Emails proving he knew about safety violations at that factory in Malaysia but covered them up. Witness statements from former employees about discriminatory practices. And my personal favorite, documentation that he's been systematically undervaluing Pierce Technologies' assets to drive down the stock price before the merger. Does he know you have all this?" Maya's smile was predatory. "He thinks all evidence was destroyed months ago. He doesn't know I have sources inside his own legal department, people who are tired of covering up his dirty work." Before Christabel could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from the hospital's financial department. Urgent. Insurance authorization for experimental treatment denied. Please contact billing office immediately. Her hands began to shake. He's cut off our insurance. Maya grabbed the phone, reading quickly. That son of a bitch. He's trying to force you to back down. He knows I can't afford the treatment on my own, even if I liquidated everything in my name, which is exactly what he wants. You broke, desperate, crawling back to accept whatever terms he offers. Maya's voice hardened. Not this time. Check your email. Christabel opened her laptop, finding a new message from Maya with dozens of attachments. What is all this? Remember that charity board member you introduced me to last month? Turns out she's also on the board of a major medical research foundation, one that's very interested in funding experimental treatments for children with rare conditions, especially when there's a compelling human interest story involved. Hope flickered in Christabel's chest. You found funding? Better. I found a way to make Colton's cruelty cost him everything he cares about. Open the press release draft. The document was headed, Sebastian Enterprises CEO denies life-saving treatment to 2-year-old daughter while celebrating engagement to mistress. Maya, I can't using Zara's illness like this. Why not? He's using it against you. He's counting on your maternal instinct to protect her privacy. But sometimes, Christabel, the best protection is a spotlight so bright it burns away all the shadows where monsters hide. A small sound from the bed made both women turn. Zara was stirring, whimpering slightly as she woke to another day of treatments and tests. "Mommy!" Her voice was small, frightened. "I don't feel good." Christabel was at her side instantly, smoothing back sweat-dampened curls. "I know, baby, but you're being so brave. Mommy's right here." "Where's Daddy?" "You said he would come." The question, innocent as it was, felt like a knife to Christabel's heart. Before she could answer, a nurse appeared with the morning medication round. "Good morning, Miss Zara. Ready for your medicine? Look, we have a special surprise today. Captain America stickers for being such a good patient." While the nurse went through their morning routine, Christabel stepped into the hallway with Maya, leaving the door cracked to hear Zara. "Do it," she said quietly. "Release everything. But Maya, make it hurt. Make it destroy everything he loves. His reputation, his company, his perfect new life. Make him feel what it's like to lose everything that matters." Maya squeezed her hand. "Already on it. The press release goes out at noon, prime time for the business news cycle. By dinner, every major outlet will be running the story. By tomorrow morning, his board will be calling for his head. He'll try to spin it. Paint me as a bitter ex-wife. Say I'm exploiting our daughter. Let him try. I've got video of him literally walking past this hospital to attend his engagement party. Phone records showing he ignored calls from Dr. Chen. Witnesses who will testify about his pattern of neglect. Trust me, Chris, by the time I'm done, the only person anyone will be painting as bitter and exploitative is him." As if on cue, Christabel's phone lit up with another text from Colton. "Meeting with lawyers this morning. Final divorce terms. Full custody to me. Supervised visitation for you. Ironclad NDA. Take it or the insurance stays cancelled. You have 1 hour to decide." She showed the message to Maya, whose eyes narrowed dangerously. "Perfect. Another nail in his coffin. Forward that to me. We'll add it to the evidence of extortion." Inside the room, they could hear Zara chattering with the nurse about her stickers, her voice weaker than usual, but still full of innocent joy. The sound strengthened Christabel's resolve. "One condition," she said to Maya. "We protect Zara as much as possible. I want him destroyed, but not at the cost of her privacy." "Already handled. The press release focuses on his actions, not her specific condition." She's presented as a brave little girl, failed by her father, not a victim to be pitied. Trust me, when this breaks, she'll be everyone's hero, and he'll be New York's most hated man. Christabel looked at her watch. 3 hours until the press release. 3 hours until she officially declared war on one of the most powerful men in Manhattan. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Regina. "Baby girl, just saw the news about that man's engagement. Say the word and I'll be there in 20 minutes with your grandmother's lawyer and a baseball bat." Despite everything, Christabel smiled. Then she opened her banking app and began transferring everything she could access into accounts Colton couldn't touch. Let him play games with insurance. She had other plans. The nurse emerged from Zara's room. "She's asking for her father again," she said quietly. "Should I tell her?" "No," Christabel interrupted. "I'll handle it." She turned to Maya. "Release everything. Every document, every photo, every piece of evidence. But first..." She pulled up her own email and began composing a message to Sebastian Enterprises' entire board of directors. "What are you doing?" Maya asked, reading over her shoulder, giving them one chance to distance themselves from the blast radius. After noon, anyone still standing with Colton Sebastian goes down with him. She hit send, then walked back into her daughter's room. Zara had dozed off again, her Captain America stickers proudly displayed on the IV pole beside her bed. "Mummy's here, baby," she whispered, stroking Zara's cheek. "And I promise you, after today, no one will ever hurt you again." Her phone lit up with email responses from board members already, some outraged, some panicked, some clearly trying to save themselves. Let them scramble. Let them choose sides. In 3 hours, none of it would matter. Because in 3 hours, the world would learn exactly what kind of man Colton Sebastian really was. And more importantly, they'd learn what kind of woman he'd foolishly chosen to cross. Maya was already on her phone, coordinating with media contacts. Regina had texted again, this time with confirmation that Christabel's old office at the civil rights firm was still available if she needed it. Even Jenny, the child life specialist, seemed to sense something was happening. She appeared with extra art supplies and a knowing look. Outside the hospital windows, New York City sparkled in the morning sun, unaware that one of its most prominent power couples was about to implode spectacularly. Somewhere in that glittering landscape, Colton Sebastian was probably celebrating with his young fiancée, confident in his control over the situation. He had no idea that his perfectly orchestrated world was about to shatter. No idea that the woman he'd dismissed as a trophy wife had spent years preparing for this moment. No idea that his own arrogance had finally crafted the perfect weapon for his destruction. The machines monitoring Zara beeped steadily, marking time like a countdown. In less than 3 hours, the breaking point would become a point of no return. And Christabel Sebastian, the woman he'd tried to break, would rise from the ashes of his betrayal like an avenging angel. The war was about to begin. Chapter 9. The Plan. The headlines exploded across New York's media landscape like carefully placed bombs. Sebastian Enterprises, CEO abandons sick child for younger woman. New York Times, corporate titans family. Scandal, daughter fighting for life, while father celebrates new engagement. Wall Street Journal, heartless billionaire cuts off dying daughter's medical care. New York Post, the fall of Colton. Sebastian, a father's betrayal. Business Insider. Christabel sat in Zara's hospital room, watching the headlines roll across her laptop screen with grim satisfaction, each one hit with the precision of a sniper's bullet, systematically destroying the perfect image Colton had spent years crafting. Maya had orchestrated the media blitz perfectly. Every outlet had a different angle, but they all painted the same devastating picture. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the story broke, Board members, society friends, business associates, everyone scrambling to either distance themselves from Colton or pledge their support to her. Even his most loyal allies were jumping ship, their self-preservation instincts stronger than any loyalty to their CEO. Mrs. Sebastian? A nurse appeared in the doorway. Dr. Chen wants to discuss Zara's latest results, and there are reporters in the lobby asking for comment. No comments, Christabel said firmly, and ensure security keeps them away from this floor. My daughter's treatment is not a media circus. But even as she said it, she knew the circus was necessary. Public outrage was the weapon she needed, and it was working. Sebastian Enterprises' stock had dropped 15% in the first hour of trading. In Dr. Chen's office, the news played silently on a wall-mounted TV. The doctor muted it as Christabel entered. "I assume you're behind this media storm," Dr. Chen said without preamble. "I want you to know, we've received calls from 3 different medical research foundations offering to fund Zara's treatment. Apparently, your story has touched some powerful people." Christabel allowed herself a small smile. Maya's connections had come through exactly as planned. And Zara's condition? The latest results are promising. The treatment protocol is working better than expected. She's a fighter, Mrs. Sebastian. "Like mother, like daughter," said a voice from the doorway. Regina Morgan stood there, her expression fierce with maternal pride. "Baby girl, you should see the chaos in the lobby. That man's perfect world is crumbling faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane." Back in Zara's room, Maya arrived with more ammunition. Pierce Technologies board just called an emergency session. Apparently they're not thrilled about their CEO's daughter being involved in a scandal that's tanking their merger partner's stock. How bad is the damage? Sebastian Enterprises is in freefall. The merger deal is dead, and we haven't even released the evidence about the offshore accounts yet. Maya's smile was predatory. Wait until the SEC sees the timing of certain stock trades around the Pierce deal. A weak voice from the bed interrupted their plotting. "Mommy!" "Why are people saying mean things about Daddy on TV?" Christabel was at Zara's side instantly, smoothing back her curls. "Don't worry about that, baby. How are you feeling?" "Tired. But look, my numbers are better." Zara pointed proudly to the medical chart, where nurses tracked her progress with colorful stickers. "Dr. Chen says I'm being super brave." "You are brave, my love. The bravest girl in the world." While Regina took over entertaining Zara, Christabel stepped into the hallway with Maya to continue their discussion. "Colton's lawyers have been calling non-stop," Maya reported. "They're offering a new deal. Full medical coverage for Zara, generous alimony, shared custody. All you have to do is publicly retract the story and sign an NDA." "He still thinks this is about money," Christabel mused. "He doesn't understand what's really happening, does he?" "Oh, he will, especially after Cordelia sees this." Maya handed over her tablet, showing an email chain that had been anonymously leaked to several gossip sites. In it, Colton and his lawyers discussed strategy for the Pierce Technologies merger, including his plan to use Cordelia as a pawn, then discard her once the deal was done. As if on cue, Christabel's phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. "This is Cordelia. We need to talk." They met in the hospital's private dining room. Neutral territory that would remind Cordelia exactly what she was involving herself in. The younger woman arrived looking distinctly less polished than usual, her designer outfit rumpled, her eyes showing signs of tears. "Is it true?" she demanded without preamble. "The emails, the merger strategy, all of it?" "You mean, did he target you specifically because using the CEO's daughter would make the hostile takeover easier? Did he plan every spontaneous romantic moment to manipulate you, just like he did with me?" Christabel's smile was razor-sharp. "What do you think?" "He said he loved me. He said this time was different. He said the same things to me with the same practiced sincerity. Tell me, did he take you to Le Bernardin for your first date? Did he fly you to Paris for lunch because you mentioned loving French art? Cordelia's face crumpled. How did you... Because it's all a script, Cordelia. One he's perfected over years of corporate acquisitions. The only difference is, usually he's acquiring companies. Occasionally, he acquires wives. I didn't know about your daughter, about the insurance, the treatments. I swear, if I'd known. But you did know he was married. Known he had a child. You just didn't care because you thought you were special, different, the one who would finally change him. Christabel's voice was steel wrapped in silk. How does it feel to learn you're just another entry in his acquisition ledger? Tears streamed down Cordelia's cheeks as she pulled off the massive engagement ring. What do you want from me? Everything you know about the merger, every conversation, every document, every detail that could help the SEC investigation. In return, I'll make sure you're portrayed as another victim of Colton's manipulation, not a willing accomplice. He'll destroy me. He'll try. But trust me, when I'm done with Colton Sebastian, he won't have the power to destroy anyone ever again. After Cordelia left, clutching Maya's business card like a lifeline, Christabel returned to Zara's room. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully, the evening treatments having worn her out. Regina looked up from her knitting. Well? Cordelia's flipped. She'll give the SEC everything they need to prove insider trading. Between that and the evidence Maya uncovered, good. Regina's needles clicked steadily. That man needs to learn you don't mess with a mother's child. Christabel's phone buzzed with an urgent news alert. Breaking. Pierce Technologies withdraws from merger amid scandal. Sebastian Enterprises stock in free fall. Another message followed immediately, from Colton. What the hell have you done? Do you have any idea what you're destroying? She typed back a single response. Everything you love. Just like you tried to do to us. Maya had sent over the next day's planned revelations. Evidence of tax evasion, workplace discrimination, environmental violations. Each scandal carefully timed for maximum impact. Each revelation designed to strip away another layer of Colton's power. The machines monitoring Zara beeped steadily, a rhythm that had become almost soothing. Outside the hospital windows, New York's lights twinkled like stars, unaware that one of its most powerful men was watching his empire crumble. Let him rage, let him threaten, let him finally understand what it felt like to be helpless while everything you loved was taken away. Christabel settled into the chair beside Zara's bed, prepared for another night of vigilant watching. Her daughter's treatment was working. The latest tests showed improvement. Soon they'd be able to leave the hospital. But by then, the world they returned to would be very different, because Christabel Sebastian wasn't just fighting for her daughter's health anymore. She was dismantling an empire, piece by piece, with the same ruthless precision Colton had once used to build it. And she was just getting started. The next phase of her plan was already in motion. Tomorrow, the SEC would receive an anonymous tip about certain offshore accounts. The day after, evidence of discriminatory hiring practices would leak to civil rights organizations. By the end of the week, Colton Sebastian would learn exactly what happened when you underestimated a mother's love. Let him think he still had control. Let him believe his money and power could save him. He'd learn soon enough that some things were stronger than legal documents and social standing. Some things, like a mother's determination to protect her child, could break any chains, overcome any obstacle. Zara stirred in her sleep, making those tiny baby sounds that made Christabel's heart swell with love. She lifted her daughter's hand, kissing it gently. "Sweet dreams, my little warrior," she whispered. "Mommy's here, and Mommy's going to change the world for you." Outside the hospital window, the New York skyline glittered like 1,000 promises. Somewhere in that concrete jungle, Colton Sebastian was probably in his office, trying desperately to save his crumbling empire, unaware that his greatest mistake wasn't his cruelty or his greed. It was underestimating the woman he'd tried to break. Because Christabel Sebastian wasn't broken. She was reforged, stronger than ever, with a purpose that went beyond revenge. She was going to make sure no other woman fell for Colton's schemes, no other child suffered from his coldness. She was going to use his own weapons, money, power, influence, to build something better from the ashes of his empire. And she was going to make him watch every second of it. Chapter 10. The Web Titans. The SEC conference room was intimidatingly austere, all glass and steel with views of downtown Manhattan. Cordelia Pierce sat ramrod straight in her chair, her Chanel suit a stark contrast to the government investigator's practical attire. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed forward a USB drive. "Everything's there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every email, every meeting recording, every document about the merger. Including," she glanced nervously at her lawyer, "including the private conversations about using my relationship with Colton to manipulate stock prices." Senior investigator James Martinez raised an eyebrow as he plugged in the drive. "You recorded your private conversations with Mr. Sebastian." "Christabel suggested I might want insurance," Cordelia replied. She was right. Across town at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Christabel watched the hospital room's TV as financial news networks exploded with breaking updates. Pierce Technologies, IRS cooperates with CEAS. Sebastian Enterprises faces multiple investigations. Wedding of the year becomes scandal of the decade. Maya burst into the room, her designer heels clicking rapidly across the floor. "It worked better than we hoped. Cordelia didn't just flip, she brought receipts. Literal receipts, Chris. She kept every dinner bill, every hotel invoice, every gift receipt. And she time-stamped everything against Sebastian Enterprises' stock movements. How bad is it for him? Bad enough that his own lawyers are probably shopping for immunity deals right now." Maya's smile was fierce. "But that's not even the best part. Guess what else was on Cordelia's phone?" Before she could answer, Regina entered with lunch for everyone. "Baby girl, you need to eat something. Can't fight dragons on an empty stomach." "In a minute, Mama." "Maya, what else did she have?" "Videos, dozens of them. Colton bragging about how he takes over companies, including some very interesting comments about using marriage as a corporate strategy. Apparently, he liked to show off for his young fiancée, explain his genius business methods." Christabel's laugh was cold. Of course he did. His ego always was his weakness. "Mrs. Sebastian," Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. "Zara's latest test results are in. Would you like to discuss them?" The doctor's smile told her everything before she even saw the charts. The treatment was working. Her baby girl was getting stronger every day. "The Research Foundation is particularly interested in her case," Dr. Chen continued. "They want to name the treatment protocol after her, the Zara Protocol, for children with similar conditions." The irony was exquisite. The child Colton had rejected as flawed would now have her name on a medical breakthrough. His shame would become her legacy. "Speaking of names," Maya interjected, "you might want to see this." She handed over her tablet, showing a leaked memo from Sebastian Enterprises' board of directors. They were discussing emergency measures, including possibly removing the Sebastian name from the company entirely to distance themselves from the scandal. Christabel's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She recognized the area code, Colton's private line. "You've made your point. Let's talk. Name your price." She showed the message to Maya, who scoffed. "Still thinks everything has a price tag." Should I have my office draft a response? No need. Christabel typed quickly. Some things can't be bought. Ask your mother. The reference would hit home. Colton's mother had been his first lesson in betrayal, abandoning him and his father for a wealthy European businessman. It was the root of his need to control, to acquire, to treat relationships like business deals. That's cruel, Maya observed with admiration. I love it. Regina, who had been quietly observing while organizing Zara's medications, spoke up. You know he won't take this lying down. A man like that, when he's cornered, is exactly where I want him, Christabel finished. Because a cornered Colton Sebastian makes mistakes. Big ones. As if on cue, her phone lit up with news alerts. Colton had called an emergency press conference, attempting to get ahead of the scandal. But his performance was a disaster. Defensive, angry, entitled. He attacked Christabel's character, called Cordelia unstable, even suggested his own board was conspiring against him. Look at his eyes, Maya said, studying the footage. He's terrified. And he should be. The SEC just froze his personal accounts pending investigation. His corporate credit cards are suspended. Even his private jet is grounded. What about the offshore accounts? That's the beautiful part. Remember those transfers he made right after cancelling Zara's insurance? Turns out moving money to avoid medical obligations is a special kind of fraud, the kind that gets federal prosecutors very interested. Zara stirred in her hospital bed, drawing Christabel's attention immediately. Mommy, can we go home soon? Soon, baby. The doctors say you're getting stronger every day. I heard the nurses talking. They said Daddy did bad things. Is that why he doesn't visit anymore? Christabel's heart clenched. Even now, her daughter's perception amazed her. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt other people, but you don't need to worry about that. Mommy's making sure no one can hurt us again. Maya waited until Zara had dozed off again before continuing their discussion. The next phase is ready. We've got whistleblowers from 3 different Sebastian subsidiaries ready to testify about environmental violations. The EPA is very interested. Release it, Christabel ordered. And Maya, make sure the evidence about the Malaysian factory leads back to Pierce Technologies. Let's see how Cordelia's father reacts when he realizes Colton was setting him up to take the fall for safety violations. The strategy was working perfectly. Each new revelation forced more allies to abandon Colton. Each betrayal pushed him closer to the edge, and tomorrow would bring the biggest blow yet. The trust fund documents are ready, Maya reported. Once we show how he's been embezzling from his own daughter's medical trust, his remaining supporters will run for the hills. Christabel smiled grimly. No one wants to back a man who steals from sick children. Regina shook her head in admiration. I taught you to be strong, baby girl, but this is art. I learned from the best, Mama. I watched how Colton destroyed his enemies for years. Now he gets to experience it himself. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Colton. You have no idea what you're doing. I built this empire. I can burn it down just as easily. She showed the message to Maya, who laughed. He still thinks he's in control. Should we show him the video? Not yet. Let him make threats. Each one is more evidence for the restraining order. Outside the hospital windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in that glittering cityscape, Colton Sebastian was watching his world burn, making desperate moves to save himself. Let him try. The web was too tight, the trap too perfect. Each struggle would only entangle him further. Christabel looked at her sleeping daughter, then at the army of women who had helped her execute this plan. Maya, with her legal brilliance, Regina with her unwavering strength, even Cordelia with her perfectly timed betrayal. Colton had spent his life underestimating women, seeing them as accessories or acquisitions. He was about to learn just how costly that mistake could be. The web was tightening, and the spider was done playing with her prey. Chapter 11. The Fall. The Four Seasons penthouse suite had been Colton Sebastian's favorite place to celebrate his victories. Now it would witness his greatest defeat. Christabel watched from across the opulent room as her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, paced like a caged animal, his perfect facade cracking with each step. "You think you've won?" he snarled, running a hand through his usually immaculate hair. "You really think you can destroy everything I've built?" "I haven't destroyed anything, Colton," Christabel replied calmly. "You did that yourself. I'm just making sure everyone sees what you really are." She hadn't wanted this meeting, but Maya insisted it was necessary. Let him see his downfall coming. Let him understand exactly how completely he'd lost control. "Mrs. Sebastian?" The hotel room's phone interrupted their standoff. "Federal agents are here with a warrant. Should I send them up?" "Yes, please do." Colton's face went from red to white. "What have you done?" "Nothing compared to what you did." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through documents. "Fraud, embezzlement, insider trading. And those are just the financial crimes. Shall we discuss the environmental violations, the discriminatory hiring practices, the mysterious accidents at your overseas factories? You can't prove any of that." "Actually, we can. Your perfect little replacement wife kept very detailed records. Did you really think Cordelia was just another naive socialite? She's been building a case against you since day one. Insurance against exactly this kind of situation." The door opened, admitting a team of FBI agents led by Senior Agent Thompson. They moved with practiced efficiency, securing the room's exits. "Mr. Sebastian," Thompson began formally, "we have a warrant for your arrest on multiple federal charges, including securities fraud and embezzlement from a medical trust fund." "This is ridiculous," Colton blustered. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, sir. That's precisely why we're here." As the agents began reading him his rights, Christabel's phone buzzed with a message from Maya. "Turn on CNBC now." The suite's massive TV came to life showing breaking news. Sebastian Enterprises, board votes to remove CEO, criminal charges pending. The scrolling ticker told the rest of the story. Sebastian Enterprises, stock suspended from trading. Multiple regulatory investigations launched. Pierce Technologies terminates merger. Files lawsuit. Board appoints interim CEO. Major shareholders demand emergency meeting. "You're finished, Colton," Christabel said softly. "Your board has abandoned you. Your legal team is cooperating with prosecutors. Even your society friends are distancing themselves. No one wants to be associated with a man who stole from his sick child's trust fund." "That money was mine," he shouted, lunging forward only to be restrained by agents. "Everything was mine. You were nothing before me, just another ambitious lawyer from Detroit. I made you." "No," she corrected him calmly. "You tried to acquire me, like one of your corporate takeovers. But you forgot something crucial. Mothers are not merchandise. We can't be bought, sold, or discarded when something newer comes along." Her phone buzzed again, this time with a photo from Regina. Zara was sitting up in her hospital bed, coloring and smiling. Her latest test results showed the treatment was working better than anyone had hoped. "You know what the real irony is," Christabel continued, showing him the photo. "The daughter you rejected as flawed. Her case is revolutionizing treatment protocols. The Zara Protocol, they're calling it. Your perfect legacy won't be Sebastian Enterprises or your corporate empire. It will be the child you tried to erase." Something in Colton's face changed, a flash of genuine emotion breaking through his mask. For a moment she glimpsed the wounded little boy whose mother had abandoned him, who'd spent his life trying to control everything and everyone to prevent ever being hurt again. But any sympathy she might have felt vanished as she remembered all the pain he'd caused, all the lives he'd casually destroyed in his pursuit of power. Mrs. Sebastian, Agent Thompson interrupted. We'll need you to come downtown to make a formal statement. Of course. Maya has all the documentation ready. Financial records, emails, recorded conversations. Everything you need to make the charges stick. You planned this, Colton realized, his voice hollow. All of it. The media leaks, Cordelia's betrayal, the SEC investigation. You orchestrated everything. I learned from the best, she replied. You taught me how to destroy someone completely. The only difference is you did it for profit. I did it for love. As the agents led him away, Christabel noticed his usually perfect suit was wrinkled, his Italian leather shoes scuffed. The great Colton Sebastian, reduced to just another white-collar criminal, being led away in handcuffs. Her phone buzzed one final time, a message from Cordelia. It's done. Father just filed the lawsuit. The evidence you provided about the factory cover-ups. Colton will never work in this industry again. Thank you, she typed back. The SEC will remember your cooperation. The Four Seasons suite felt suddenly empty, the weight of all that had happened settling like dust after an explosion. Christabel walked to the window, looking out over the city that had witnessed her transformation from naive society wife to avenging angel. Maya appeared in the doorway, designer briefcase bulging with documents. Ready for Phase 2. The civil suits are prepared, and the victims' families from the Malaysian factory are willing to testify. No, Christabel said quietly. We're done. But we could take everything. The penthouses, the Hamptons estate, the art collection. I don't want his things, Maya. I just wanted him to understand what it feels like to lose everything you love, to be helpless while your world crumbles. She turned from the window. Now I want to focus on what really matters. Back at Memorial Sloan Kettering, she found Regina reading stories to a much-improved Zara. Her daughter's color was better, her energy returning with each successful treatment. Mommy! Zara's face lit up. Look what I drew! The picture showed 3 figures, a woman and a little girl holding hands, with a man in the background getting smaller and smaller, as if walking away. It's beautiful, baby, Christabel said, fighting back tears. Just like you. Dr. Chen says I can go home soon. Can we get a new home? One without Daddy's angry face in all the pictures. Yes, my love. We'll make a new home, one filled with nothing but love and joy. Outside the hospital windows, news helicopters circled the financial district, covering the aftermath of Colton Sebastian's spectacular fall. But here in this room, none of that mattered. What mattered was the steady beep of medical monitors showing her daughter getting stronger. What mattered was the pile of Get Well cards from children's charities and medical foundations interested in supporting similar cases. What mattered was the future they would build from the ashes of Colton's destruction. Let the media call it a scandal. Let society whisper about revenge and betrayal. They didn't understand that this was never about destroying Colton Sebastian. It was about protecting what he'd tried to dismiss as worthless, a mother's love, a child's spirit, the strength that comes from being perfectly imperfect. And in that, Christabel had already won the only victory that mattered. Chapter 12. Sweet Justice. The Manhattan Federal Courthouse loomed against a steel-gray sky, its marble steps crowded with reporters and photographers. Christabel Sebastian ascended them with the grace of a queen entering battle, her Alexander McQueen suit as much armor as clothing. Maya walked beside her, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that would seal Colton Sebastian's fate. 5 years of marriage, 2 years of planning, 1 month of executing the perfect revenge. It all came down to this moment. Inside the courtroom, the air crackled with tension. The gallery was packed with New York's elite, former board members, society friends, business associates, all here to witness the fall of one of their own. Cordelia Pierce sat in the front row, her father beside her, both ready to testify about Colton's manipulation and fraud. When they brought him in, Christabel almost didn't recognize her soon-to-be ex-husband. Gone were the bespoke suits and carefully maintained appearance. Prison had stripped away his polish, leaving behind a hollow shell of the man who'd once ruled Manhattan's corporate world. All rise. The United States District Court for the Southern District of New York is now in session. The Honorable Justice Elena Martinez presiding. The judge, a formidable woman known for her zero tolerance of white-collar crime, surveyed the courtroom. Before we proceed with sentencing, would the defendant like to make a statement? Colton stood, his handcuffs catching the fluorescent light. Your Honor, I've built my life creating value, generating jobs, contributing to society. One mistake. Mistake? Christabel couldn't help herself. She stood, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to address the court. Judge Martinez nodded. Proceed, Mrs. Sebastian. Christabel moved to the podium, pulling out a single photograph, Zara in her hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment. This is not about a mistake. This is about a pattern of calculated cruelty, about a man who saw his own daughter's illness as an inconvenience to his social climbing, who cancelled her medical insurance while shopping for engagement rings with his mistress. She turned, facing not just the judge but the packed gallery. But more than that, this is about every person Colton Sebastian has destroyed in his pursuit of power. The workers in his Malaysian factory who died because he covered up safety violations, the employees he discriminated against, the companies he destroyed through fraudulent practices. Maya approached with more evidence, photographs, documents, testimonies, each one another nail in Colton's coffin. The prosecution has demonstrated Mr. Sebastian's guilt on multiple federal charges, Judge Martinez said. The question now is sentencing. Your Honor, Christabel continued, her voice steady, we're not asking for revenge. We're asking for justice, not just for my daughter, but for every victim of corporate greed who was seen as disposable, every person treated as a mere entry in a ledger. The judge studied the evidence before her, then looked directly at Colton. Mr. Sebastian, you've been found guilty of securities fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion, and multiple counts of wire fraud. More than the financial crimes, you've demonstrated a pattern of moral bankruptcy that this court finds particularly disturbing. She paused, letting the tension build. I sentence you to 30 years in federal prison. Additionally, you are ordered to pay $100 million in restitution to be distributed among your victims, with a significant portion allocated to a foundation supporting children with rare medical conditions. The gallery erupted in murmurs. 30 years, the maximum sentence. Even Maya looked shocked. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am ordering the creation of an independent trust for Zara Sebastian's medical care to be funded from the seized assets. Mrs. Sebastian will have sole control of this trust. Colton slumped in his chair, finally broken. The great corporate raider, brought down by the woman he'd tried to destroy. As court officers led him away, he turned to Christabel one last time. You really think this makes you better than me? No, Colton, she replied calmly. What makes me better is that I did this for love, not power, and that makes all the difference. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. But Christabel's attention was drawn to a small figure running up the steps, dark curls bouncing in the spring breeze. Mommy! Zara, now 5 and thriving thanks to the groundbreaking treatment protocol that bore her name, launched herself into her mother's arms. The birthmark that Colton had seen as a flaw was barely visible now, faded with time and advanced medical care. Regina followed more sedately, pride shining in her eyes. Baby girl, you did it. Maya emerged from handling the press, grinning. The Zara Foundation is already getting donations. Your story has touched a lot of people, Chris. Major healthcare companies want to partner on research initiatives. And Sebastian Enterprises? Christabel asked, though she already knew the answer. The board voted this morning. They're renaming it Phoenix Medical Technologies, with a focus on developing treatments for rare childhood conditions. Maya's smile widened. They want you to head the charitable foundation division. Christabel looked at her daughter, then at the courthouse, where justice had finally been served. I have a better idea. 6 months later, she stood in front of a different building, a state-of-the-art medical research facility in Harlem. The sign read, Morgan Sebastian Center for Children's Medical Research, named in honor of both her mother's strength and her daughter's courage. Zara, dressed in a miniature lab coat for the opening ceremony, helped her cut the ribbon. Reporters called out questions about Colton, about revenge, about the dramatic fall of a corporate titan. But Christabel's focus was on the families entering the center. Parents holding sick children, their eyes filled with the same desperate hope she'd once felt. Each one would receive the care they needed, regardless of their ability to pay. Mrs. Sebastian, a reporter called out. Any comment on reports that Colton Sebastian is appealing his sentence? She smiled, pulling Zara close. My comment is this. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning. Sometimes what seems like a flaw is really a gift. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't in destroying your enemies, but in building something beautiful from the ashes of their cruelty. That evening, as she tucked Zara into bed in their new brownstone home, warm, welcoming, and completely free of Colton's influence, her daughter asked a question. Mommy, are you still angry at Daddy? Christabel considered carefully. No, baby, I'm grateful. Grateful? Yes, because his mistakes taught me what real strength is, and his cruelty showed me what real love can overcome. She kissed her daughter's forehead, right on the faded birthmark that had started it all. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, but inside was all the warmth and love Colton's cold world had lacked. Let him plot his appeals from his prison cell. Let him rage against his fate. His time was over. This was their time. For healing, for building, for proving that the greatest revenge isn't in destroying what's wrong, but in creating something truly right. In her office at the medical center, a framed news article hung on the wall. Phoenix Rising, How a Mother's Love Transformed Corporate Greed into Medical Hope. Below it sat a small plaque bearing words that had become her mantra. Some marks are flaws only to those too blind to see their beauty. Some wounds become wings for those brave enough to fly. And some endings are really just beautiful beginnings in disguise. Subscribe if you liked.